to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join me in real time by sending me your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We live stream Headline Buster at 11 a.m. Beijing time on Thursdays and air the segment on TV at 11:30 a.m. on Friday. So do join us during the live streaming and get in touch. I would love to receive and possibly read out your insightful comments or questions. This week, we're looking at media reports on Hong Kong as it marked 25 years since its return to Chinese rule on July the 1st. Are they more celebratory or derogatory? What angles are emphasized and what kind of Hong Kong do they want to show to the world? First, a quick recap. It was a big week for Hong Kong. Chinese President Xi Jinping traveled to Hong Kong in what is known as his first visit outside the Chinese mainland since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. He attended over 10 events, the most important of which, of course, would be the inaugural ceremony of the sixth-term government of the Hong Kong SAR, led by the new chief executive Zhang Li, and other celebrations marking the 25th anniversary of the city's return to Chinese rule. President Xi gave a highly anticipated speech at the inaugural ceremony in which he made it more than clear the central government's commitment to sticking to the one country, two systems arrangement.
这样的好制度
There's no reason for us to change such a good policy, and we must adhere to it in the long run. From disarray to good governance, Hong Kong is entering a new phase of becoming more prosperous. The next 5 years are important for Hong Kong to break new ground and achieve another leap forward.
开创新局面，实现新飞跃的关键期。
He also praised Hong Kong for having made irreplaceable contributions to the country's economic miracle and hailed the resilience of the Hong Kong people who have weathered all kinds of challenges, including social unrest and the COVID-19 pandemic in just the past few years. There's indeed a lot to celebrate if you take a look at the hard facts. Hong Kong's per capita GDP, for instance, has doubled since its return, from 25,000 USD to nearly 50,000 USD. The stock market value increased by some eightfold. The average man and woman in the city are living 6 and 5 years longer, the highest life expectancy in the world. Hong Kong has consolidated its status as the international trade, finance and shipping center. Its total foreign trade in goods more than tripled to reach around $1.3 trillion in 2021. It's the mainland's largest source of inbound direct investments and outbound investment destination. It's the world's largest offshore renminbi business center, handling over 70% of the total share. As of April 2022, over 1,300 mainland enterprises were publicly listed in Hong Kong, accounting for over 53% of the total number of companies listed there. As one of the busiest and most efficient international container ports in the world, Hong Kong handled nearly 18 million TEUs of containers in 2021. The port provides some 270 international container liner services per week, connecting nearly 600 destinations worldwide. But it's not just about economics, it's also about governance. According to the World Bank Group, Hong Kong's percentile rank in respect of the rule of law was some 70 in 1996. It kept rising steadily and since 2003 has remained consistently above 90. That's higher than the United States after 2018, as you can see in the blue line. Now, after the new national security law was enacted for Hong Kong, the city's rule of law, which was feared to have been eroded, has actually remained intact. This was backed up by the latest rule of law index of the World Justice Project, which showed Hong Kong ranking 19th out of 139 countries or territories in 2021, similar to the UK. So despite ups and downs, there's a lot to look forward to. Hong Kong's next chapter includes making the city into a global hub for innovation and technology, a center in the Asia-Pacific region for international legal and dispute resolution services, and a center for cultural and art exchanges. 25 years after return, Hong Kong emerged from instability and is now on its way to prosperity. That's the expectation from the central government in Beijing. But how has the Western media portrayed the milestone? This week, we grouped the samples into some themes. Let me explain. First up, the tendency for media stories to use headlines laced with opinions rather than reporting on the facts. There's no shortage of such examples. Here's one from the New York Times that says, "Xi tells a muted Hong Kong that political power is for patriots." Political power for patriots, isn't it the same for any country around the world? In the United States, would they allow power to be shared by those deemed unpatriotic? Why is it a problem for Hong Kong to be run by patriots? The headlines calls Hong Kong muted, but the same article says that people enjoy their liberties, which under the one country, two systems arrangement appeared, quote unquote, mostly intact. So why the loaded headline? The Washington Post says China's Xi begins victory lap in Hong Kong. Locals are wary. But this victory lap phrase was plucked from one analyst sharing his personal opinion. Other analysts who have other sides of the story were, well, not quoted in the headline. Muted, maybe. And it's clear what the article wants the readers to believe, right? And surely not all locals are wary. This headline is better suited for an opinion piece, maybe. And Al Jazeera. As China tightens grip, Hong Kong's luster as world city dims. Tighten grip. I've seen that 1,000 times, haven't you? It's so boring. I mean, if you want to talk about this, at least find a different expression or a different way to put it, right? Or maybe the writers or the editors are tired of smearing Hong Kong too. Beware of such word game, by the way. When China strengthens national security, it's called tightening grip. When a Western country does that, what would it be called? Improving governance or promoting national security? All these stories, in my eyes, miss one big point. The measures taken by Beijing over the past few years was a reaction to the brewing political instability in the city. For years, Beijing adopted a largely laissez-faire attitude towards Hong Kong's affairs, only to find the situation potentially spiraling out of control, compelling the central government to intervene. That's what happened. Don't get that wrong. And then there's the Wall Street Journal with a headline that reads, Xi Jinping visits Hong Kong to mark anniversary, capping crushing of dissent. Wouldn't just the first part suffice for a news story headline? An objective headline is really hard to come by these days, it seems. Now, in contrast, this headline from the South China Morning Post looks neutral and down to earth. Xi Jinping's speech at 25th anniversary of handover ceremony is most definitive assessment of one country, two systems and a calming pill for doubters. Beijing official. The next thing we noticed is some questionable logic being used to support a certain idea. Here's what I mean. And this is a story from AFP published by Radio France International about Hong Kong's economic importance. The article shows how Hong Kong's economy has evolved since 1997, saying China's meteoric rise in the past 2 decades yielded vast benefits for Hong Kong, which became the gateway for mainland firms to raise funds and for foreign businesses to access what is today the world's second largest economy. That is true. But then, the article says, Hong Kong's GDP, meanwhile, has gone from being equivalent to 18% of mainland China's in 1997 to less than 3% in 2020. Well, It's also true. But does it mean that Hong Kong's future is uncertain? I don't get it. According to the article, which uses data from the World Bank, the Chinese mainland's economy was less than $1 trillion in 1997, and now it's something like 15 trillion US dollars. Of course, the relevant importance of Hong Kong, the city, dropped. It's only natural, right? Does that mean the future of Hong Kong is uncertain? Not necessarily. But it does show how data can be skewed to try and paint a certain picture. And finally, let's talk about photographs used in articles on the 25th anniversary. Most of the articles we just talked about use the same, almost the same combination of the same formula: police, protests, and pandemic, as if that's all what Hong Kong is about. Since they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, I'll save my breath. A few media, including the CNN, the Guardian, and Washington Post, actually came up with the idea of publishing photo galleries to sum up Hong Kong's recent history. Good idea, nice idea, but take a look at some of the pictures that were on show and tell me how you feel about these images. British soldiers posing with broad smiles, a British royal family inspecting the poor in Hong Kong, or British gentlemen posing for a group photo, so on and so forth. The colonial era looked romantic, almost with a touch of nostalgia. Not only that, you would also notice all these media use the color black as a background, implying what? That this is something to mourn for instead of to celebrate? For the West, maybe it is something to mourn for, that they are losing leverage and influence in the city, that Hong Kong is no longer a defenseless place, that under Chinese rule, Hong Kong, despite challenges, remain alive and kicking, that China has managed to bring stability back to the city despite all kinds of efforts to destabilize it. Let's mourn, indeed, for the West's failure to use capitalist Hong Kong to sabotage socialist China. The day when the West is able to accept that fact, that Hong Kong is part of China, socialist China, we may see more neutral reports in the media. That's my monologue on this subject. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll discuss the subject of Hong Kong's 25th anniversary with three panelists from different parts of the world. Stay with us. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point. Welcome back to Headline Buster. I'm pleased to be joined by three guests from Hong Kong: Legislative Council member and board member of the United Nations Association of China, Ms. Nixie Lam; Professor Rick Dunham from the School of Journalism and Communication of Tsinghua University is joining us from Washington, D.C., and Professor Wang Jiangyu from the School of Law of the City University of Hong Kong joining us from Hong Kong. To all three of you, welcome to this edition of Headline Buster. Let me go to Nixie first, because you are in Hong Kong. Tell us a little bit about the mood in the past week in the city. I know, of course, not everybody would be happy with the occasion, but what is the general mood, in terms of a celebration of this very important anniversary?
I think people are very excited, despite that we have a little typhoon in between. But people are quite excited, perhaps parading the celebration and as well at the day. Some of my previous voters, my constituency members, were sending me little videos or photos when President Xi Jinping was giving his speech on TV. She actually waved her little flag and make a little video to me to say, "I'm listening to the talk," and stuff like that. So I see a lot of the normal citizens are quite excited about the occasion, especially after what's been happening in 2019 and 20 and all that. And we know like a lot of the international media is trying to make us look bad or things like that, but that is totally not true. If you walk in the street, all the positive vibes actually came out.
Yeah, but if you just read some of these stories, you feel as if, it's something to mourn for, or that everybody is wary. Rick, I know you, you are frequent on the show. I know not all of these media are representing, how should I say?
Yes.
I shouldn't make the worst out of these. I shouldn't say that these headlines represent everybody in the international media. I guess some of the headlines are more leaning to one side of the opinion than the others. But how do you look at the difference, Rick, between the celebratory tone that Nixie just mentioned in the city and what you get from these headlines, as I mentioned, for instance, using black as a background for these reports, as if it's really, something to cry for?
Well, as usual, I agree with some of your analysis and I disagree with others. I do think that what you're saying about having black as a background is wrong, because when I teach in my multimedia journalism course and photo galleries, I teach that you want to have a black background because it makes it more grounded on a screen or on a page. Whereas if you have white in the background, it sort of floats in air. So I don't think that is showing editorial bias. But some of the headlines, you definitely were right. They were what I call clickbait headlines, and they did not reflect what was in the story. I think the stories were much more balanced, had different points of view. I mean, they had some points of view that you would disagree with, and that the Chinese government would disagree with. And I do agree with Ms. Lam that there wasn't as much about the celebratory atmosphere, just like the 4th of July in the United States this year. I mean, most of the coverage in the United States was on another mass shooting on the 4th of July, not happy people in most of the cities. But I mean, overall, I do think that most of the coverage that I read reflected a wide range of thoughts. But I do agree with you that there are certain themes in a lot of the international coverage that are critical of the actions that the government in Beijing and the leadership in Hong Kong have taken over the past 3 years.
Well, I can understand your interpretation could be different. The use of color, black, for instance. However, my observation has been, for instance, they don't use black as a background for every story. For the other, stories that they want to highlight, for instance, only the story about Hong Kong is set in black for these particular, and for several of these media as well. And black, in the Chinese culture is definitely a very heavy color. It's not something for happiness. I doubt it is the case in the Western culture as well. So I think there's a message there. Professor Wang, what is your read of this, the use of color black?
Well, being based here in Hong Kong, what I'm seeing very happily is now a normal functioning society which comes back to life. And people are generally quite happy here. But I do understand that the international reporting, especially Western media, ever since the national security law has been adopted, you have a change of perception and the misleading in many ways that Hong Kong is dead and Hong Kong is being muted and Hong Kong is becoming an authoritarian society. So that has become kind of a stereotype. The fixed impression, but I think it is misunderstanding. There is the gap between what people feel here, between the international perception. I certainly hope the gap can be shrink more and more in the future.
Now, President Xi talked about Hong Kong changing from stability to prosperity. So I want to focus on that question here. Nixie, what is your understanding? Do you think Hong Kong is really poised, after going through this very difficult period of time, Hong Kong is poised to go from the period of stability, of newfound political stability, to greater possibility?
Yeah, I think it's quite important. Previously, in quite some time in Hong Kong, we've been dragging into this political arguments for every single issues basically in town, and that is no good for Hong Kong. If any city they want to develop themselves, or anyone wants to have a proper family build up or career build up, you need a stable society to start with. After the enactment of the NSL, we actually already have a more stabilized Hong Kong, and the whole society went back to normal. But and then we need something to boost our future and bring us to prosperity. And that is, I think, the foundation of one country, two system, which is to have the patriot running Hong Kong, patriot administrating Hong Kong. We already done that. And I think at the moment, especially after the 1st of July, the new government, yesterday we have our first meeting, having the new chief executive coming to the legislative council. He mentioned about a lot of plans to actually tackling local issues that a lot of the civilians has been scratching their head and try to solve those issues, and things are already there. So I think that is why we're talking about we already went from stability to prosperity, because everybody having hope. If you went down to the streets of Hong Kong, a lot of people are actually discussing on giving ideas and how we can do things together, and I think the atmosphere is totally positive.
So basically, you are talking about a general sense of optimism for the future, for the next 25 years, for instance. Rick, do you think that optimism is picked up in the West, not just in the media, but also by politicians or by the general public, that actually in Hong Kong there's a sense of optimism, whereas in the West they see the direction of the city going in a more pessimistic direction? Is that the impression?
I agree with you. That is the impression, and that's the impression that's left by coverage. I do think that there is a slight difference between the long-term optimism about the economy of Hong Kong and short-term challenges, because there are short-term challenges in Hong Kong, in Beijing, all around the world, with the economy, a global recession being feared for the year ahead. For Hong Kong, the structural issue is that Hong Kong is growing, and growing in a way that the rest of the world would be happy to equal, but it's growing less quickly than the rest of China. And so really, to me, the question is, can Hong Kong find some of the dynamism and innovation that some of the other growing centers of the economy, like Shanghai and Shenzhen, have had, and then also overcoming COVID and the supply chain issues that there have been. These are short-term economic challenges, but I do think that the coverage has been so much on the stifling of political dissent that there is very little on the economy and Hong Kong's role, and really the international vibrance that still is there in Hong Kong.
Nixie, how do you see the kind of reassurances? Actually, I think he made it, he really tried to make it more than clear. As I said, he can't make it clearer what Beijing wants from Hong Kong. Did people get that message?
I think more people are doing a lot of the translation of the whole speech and things like that. I think it's much better than before, because previously, I have to be honest to say that in Hong Kong, a lot of people didn't really care about what the President Xi was having the plan for Hong Kong and things like that. But at this moment, we know that it's the foundation to have a stable society and how to excel ourselves. So a lot of people are trying to look into the speech and see what are the future for us. And especially for a lot of the local issues, as I mentioned, we've been basically hanging there for 10, 15 years, didn't really run because of the opposition's been trying to basically stop and object everything in the chambers. But at the moment, we are actually looking at some concrete plans on how to restart and restructure the whole city's backbones, on how to solve issues and things like that. I think poverty is a very significant issue, as Professor Wang just mentioned, that it shouldn't be existing in Hong Kong as such a wealthy city and well-developed city. That's why yesterday our chief executive has announced that he will have a special task force to actually look into the issue and having a 2,500 people plan to help the most vulnerable people and how to support them to make sure that issue will be looking at.
Okay. Rick, do you think what President Xi said really got picked up and can reassure any people or can be seen reassuring by people in the West or by those pundits in the West at least, that Beijing genuinely wants the system to work in Hong Kong, wants to keep Hong Kong special and relevant?
I mean, it got picked up, but it didn't get the same emphasis as the negative or critical comments. I mean, I do think that there's some skepticism. Critics will never be won over. Critics of President Xi Jinping in the West will not be won over. But I do think that that there's some coverage of this being one country, two systems when it comes to economics, if not for politics. And I think that that's significant that there is some coverage of that, because almost all the coverage for months had been the end of one country, two systems. And President Xi Jinping, in his speech, by outlining his vision for the economic component of that continuing, I do think was important for the world to understand. And I do think, as it's repeated again and again in coming months, I think more people in the world will understand.
Hopefully. Thank you very much for your analysis and sharing your insights with us. Nixie Lam joining us from Hong Kong, Professor Wang Jiangyu joining us from City University of Hong Kong, and Professor Rick Dunham from Tsinghua University are joining us from Washington, D.C. With that, we come to the end of this edition of the Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching. You've got The Point.